Someone tried to kill me on a Tuesday. I didn't know that yet. I was standing in my own kitchen, watching my daughter-in-law pour coffee into a travel mug, and I was thinking about whether I'd packed enough socks for the trip. That's the thing about betrayal. It finds you when you're thinking about socks. Her name is Serena. She married my son Adrian 3 years ago, and from the very first Sunday dinner, something about her smile never quite reached her eyes. I told myself I was being an old fool. 64 years on this earth and still suspicious of a woman who brought homemade pie to meet the parents. My wife Dottie, God rest her, would have laughed at me. Dottie passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer. 17 months from diagnosis to the last breath I held in that hospital room. After she was gone, I sold the house in Raleigh where we'd raised Adrian and moved into a smaller place in Asheville, a 2-bedroom cottage with a porch that looks out over the hills. Quiet, that's all I wanted. Quiet and the sound of wind in the trees. But Adrian worried. He's 36, works in commercial real estate, and he inherited his mother's stubborn love. He kept driving up on weekends, bringing Serena, leaving grocery bags on my porch whether I asked or not. I appreciated it, even when it annoyed me. About a year ago, Adrian sat down with me at my kitchen table and said he'd found a property. A piece of land I talked about wanting for years, 40 acres outside of town, good soil, creek running through the back. His grandfather's dream really, passed down to me, and then to him through 1,000 Saturday morning conversations over bad coffee. I can't carry the whole mortgage alone, Dad, but if you put in half, we can do this together. I said yes. Of course I said yes. It was his grandfather's dream. It was mine. We drew up the paperwork through a family attorney. Joint ownership. Adrian's name and mine. 3 months later, Adrian's company transferred him to Charlotte. He and Serena moved down. I stayed in Asheville. After that, Serena started calling more than Adrian did. Small things at first. She'd call to check in on me, ask how I was eating, remind me of doctor's appointments I hadn't forgotten. I thought she was trying. I genuinely did. I told Adrian once, I said, "Your wife is growing on me." He sounded relieved in a way that told me more than he meant to say. Then one Thursday she called and mentioned, casually like she was reading from a grocery list, that she and Adrian had been talking to a financial advisor. Something about consolidating assets, simplifying estate management. She used the phrase "for your benefit" twice in one sentence. I didn't say much. I said I'd think about it. I didn't sleep that night. The thing about getting old is that people start to treat your skepticism like a symptom. You hesitate, and they call it confusion. You say no, and they call it stubbornness. You notice something wrong, and they say you're lonely. You're grieving. You're still not over Dottie. Maybe I wasn't. But I knew what I'd heard. I called my buddy Hugh the next morning. We've known each other since we were in our 20s working the same timber yard outside of Winston-Salem. He's been retired going on 7 years now, lives about 20 minutes from me, and he has what I describe as a highly functional distrust of everyone and everything, which I have always found deeply comforting. I told him what Serena said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You got a will, Nate. My name is Nathan Briggs, but Hugh has called me Nate since 1987, and I've never once corrected him." I told him I had a will. Dottie and I had done it together, updated it once after she passed. Most everything went to Adrian. The cottage, the land investment, the small savings I'd built over 40 years of working in lumber, and then later in contracting. Hugh said, "Might be time to talk to your lawyer." 2 weeks later, Serena called and said she and Adrian were driving up Saturday to take me to breakfast. I said fine. Saturday came, and it was just Serena. Adrian had a showing he couldn't reschedule, she said. She was already in my driveway. We drove to a place I'd been going to for years, a diner called Patsy's on the edge of downtown. I ordered eggs and toast. She ordered nothing, just coffee, and watched me eat with that same smile that never quite reached anywhere. When we got back to my cottage, she walked me inside, made herself comfortable in my kitchen, and made us both coffee before I'd said a word about it. I drank it. It tasted fine. By the time she left, I was tired in a way that felt different from normal tired. I sat in my chair on the porch, and the hills went soft at the edges. I thought I was just getting old. I fell asleep in the chair and didn't wake up until it was full dark. I didn't connect it then. The second time was about 3 weeks later. She came alone again. Adrian was traveling, she said. She'd been in the area visiting a friend, she said. She had coffee with her this time. 2 cups from a place downtown. She said she remembered. I liked dark roast. She handed me the cup with both hands and smiled. I took it. I drank about half of it, standing in the kitchen doorway. 20 minutes later, I was on my bathroom floor. I don't remember falling. I remember the wall coming up very fast. And then I was on the tile, and I couldn't get my hands under me. I remember the light in the bathroom seemed too bright, and then not bright enough. I remember thinking I needed to reach the phone. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up in Mission Hospital. Hugh was sitting in a chair beside the bed reading a magazine article about fishing that he held upside down, which told me he wasn't reading it at all. "You called me," he said, when he saw my eyes open. I didn't remember calling him. He said my phone showed an outgoing call to him at 2014 in the afternoon, 22 minutes after I'd seen Serena's car pull out of my driveway. He said I hadn't spoken, just breathing, and then a thump that he told me later was the sound of me hitting the floor. He'd driven over, found my front door unlocked, found me in the bathroom, called 911. The doctor, a young woman named Dr. Reyes, who had the kind of calm that is either very reassuring or very alarming depending on the news, came in about an hour later. She said my electrolyte levels were severely disrupted. She asked if I had a heart condition. I said no. She asked if I'd eaten anything unusual. I told her about the coffee. She wrote something down. She asked if anyone else had access to my home. I said my son and his wife sometimes visited. She wrote something else down. She told me they'd run a full panel. I looked at the ceiling for a long time after she left. Hugh stayed. He didn't offer to call Adrian. He just stayed, which was the right thing to do, and he knew it without me having to say it. We watched television with the volume low, and I thought about Serena's hands holding that coffee cup out to me. Both hands, like an offering. The panel came back the next morning. Elevated levels of a compound. Dr. Reyes called with words I wrote down phonetically on the back of a hospital menu because I couldn't spell them. The short version, the way she explained it, was that something in my system shouldn't have been there, and in sufficient quantity it could cause exactly what had happened to me. She asked me gently if I wanted to speak with a social worker. I told her I wanted to speak with a detective. This is the part that nobody tells you about when you're 64 years old, and you realize someone in your family has tried to hurt you. The part where you have to decide, in a hospital bed with an IV in your arm, whether to burn the whole thing down or to think clearly. I thought about calling Adrian. I ran through it in my mind 20 times. What would I say? Your wife poisoned me. What would he say? He would call Serena, and Serena would say I was confused. She would say I was grieving. I was lonely. I was an old man who fell in his bathroom and was looking for someone to blame. She would say she'd only been there to bring me coffee, to take care of me, because I had no one else. And Adrian would believe her, not because he was stupid, but because believing her was easier than the alternative. I knew that. I knew my son, so I made a decision. I told Dr. Reyes I had slept in the bathroom. I said I'd been feeling run down. I said I appreciated everything she'd done. I signed my discharge paperwork, and Hugh drove me home. And I sat on my porch in the dark, and I made myself a plan. The plan started with a phone call to my attorney, a man named Gerald who handled Dottie's estate, and who has an office on the second floor of a brick building downtown and drinks too much sweet tea, and is one of the 3 people I trust completely. I told Gerald everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the reasons I trust him. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Do you want to protect the assets, or do you want to protect yourself?" I said both. He said, "Then we start with the will." Over the next 2 weeks, Gerald helped me restructure everything. The cottage went into a trust, the land, The 40 acres that carry my father-in-law's dream was handled separately, with specific conditions on transfer that Serena would not find easy to satisfy. Adrian remained in my will, but the structure was now more complicated than Serena would have had any reason to expect. Gerald also told me quietly that if anything happened to me before we had something more concrete, there was a letter on file in his office documenting everything I'd told him and the circumstances under which I'd told it. I said I appreciated that. He said, "Don't drink anything she gives you." The second part of the plan involved my neighbor across the road, a retired electrician named Dwayne who keeps to himself, which I respect, and who once rewired my kitchen as a favor and refused to take a cent. I asked Dwayne if he still had his old security cameras from when he used to run his own shop. He said he did. I asked if he'd help me install 2 of them inside my cottage, not the obvious ones I already had. I'd had a doorbell camera for 2 years that Serena knew about because she'd commented on it once, appreciatively, when Adrian had installed it. I wanted the 2 new ones placed where they wouldn't be seen. One in the kitchen, aimed at the counter and the stove. One in the hallway between the kitchen and the bathroom. Dwayne installed them on a Thursday afternoon. He didn't ask many questions. He tested the feeds on my laptop, made sure the motion detection worked, and handed me back the cables. "You expecting trouble?" he said. I said I was hoping I was wrong. He said, "You don't put cameras in because you're hoping you're wrong." She came back on a Saturday. Adrian was with her this time, which I hadn't expected. They brought lunch from a place he knew I liked, and we sat on the porch and ate sandwiches and talked about the land, about what we might eventually do with it. A small cabin maybe, somewhere to come in the summer. Adrian looked happy talking about it. He had his mother's eyes when he smiled, and it cost me something to sit across from him, knowing what I knew. Serena was warm and attentive. She refilled my water glass twice. She laughed at a story I told about his grandfather. When they got up to clear the plates, she went inside with the dishes, and I watched through the window as she moved around my kitchen. Nothing happened that day. They drove back to Charlotte around 5. I sat on the porch until it was dark, and I let myself wonder whether I was wrong, whether the hospital had been a coincidence, whether I was doing what everyone would say I was doing, an old man inventing threats because he was scared and alone. Then I checked the camera footage. She had opened the cabinet under my sink while she was washing the dishes. She had stood there for almost a full minute, with her back to the kitchen window, doing something I couldn't see clearly. She had closed the cabinet before Adrian came in to dry the dishes. I stared at that footage for a long time. In the morning, I called Gerald. The detective's name was Howell. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with the particular stillness of someone who has heard a great many things and learned not to show what he thought of them. He sat in my kitchen, and I laid everything out. The hospital visit, the toxicology, the camera footage, the cabinet. He watched the footage twice. He asked if I'd touched anything under the sink since Saturday. I said I hadn't. He took the small bottle of dish soap that had been sitting beside my sink and bagged it without commentary. He took 2 other items from under the sink. He asked if I had the original toxicology report from Mission Hospital. I had a copy. Gerald had advised me to keep one. Detective Howell sat across from me and said carefully, "Mr. Briggs, I want to be honest with you. This is going to take some time, and I need you to behave normally. No confrontations, no accusations, nothing that changes her behavior." I told him I understood. He said, "Can you do that?" I said I'd been doing it for 3 weeks. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "Okay." It took 6 weeks. The dish soap had been adulterated. Gerald helped me understand the lab language, which was full of the kind of technical phrasing designed to be precise and nearly impossible to follow if you hadn't spent your life in a laboratory. The short version was that something had been added to it that wasn't supposed to be there, and the amount of it that could be absorbed through repeated skin contact, through washing my hands, through handling dishes, through daily use, would have been enough, over time, to produce exactly the kind of episode I'd had in my bathroom. It was slow, patient, designed to look like an old man's health declining naturally. When I understood that, I sat with it for a long time. Because patience like that doesn't come from a moment of anger. It comes from planning. It comes from wanting something bad enough to work toward it carefully, over months, and that meant this wasn't impulse. This was intention. I thought about the land. 40 acres, good soil, creek running through the back. I thought about Serena on the phone talking about simplifying estate management. I thought about all the ways she'd been working her way into the structure of my life. The calls, the visits, the warmth, the pies she'd brought to the first Sunday dinner that I had been too stubborn to enjoy. I called Adrian, not to tell him, just to hear his voice. He talked for 20 minutes about a deal he was working on, a commercial property in Gastonia. Very excited, the way he gets when something is going well. I sat and listened, and I thought about his mother's eyes when he smiled. I said, "I love you, kid." He said, "You okay, Dad?" I said I was fine. The arraignment was on a Wednesday morning. Gerald drove me. We sat in the third row back far enough that I could see the door when it opened. Serena came in with an attorney I didn't recognize. Expensive suit, the kind of careful blankness that good defense lawyers cultivate. She sat down, and then she turned and looked at the gallery, and she found me. I don't know what she expected to see on my face. Whatever it was, I don't think she found it. Adrian was not there. He had been told the night before. Gerald had helped me think through how to handle it. Not a phone call, not alone, but in person at their apartment in Charlotte, with a copy of the detective's report and the lab results and the camera footage on a laptop. Gerald went with me. We sat in Adrian's living room, and I watched my son's face while he understood what his wife had done. I had thought I was prepared for it. I wasn't. He didn't say anything for a long time. He sat with his hands on his knees and stared at the coffee table, and I watched him go through something I didn't have the right words for then and still don't. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and he said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. He said, "I brought her into your house." I said, "You brought her into your life. That's different." He stayed in Charlotte. I told him to stay. The arraignment wasn't something he needed to witness, and it wasn't something I needed him there for. I needed him to take care of himself so that eventually, when some of this had settled, we could go back to talking about the land and the creek and what we might build there someday. Serena's attorney entered a not guilty plea. That was expected. Gerald had told me to prepare for this to take time, months, possibly longer. The evidence was strong, he said, but juries were unpredictable and defense attorneys were resourceful. I said I was 64 years old. I had time. On the drive home, Gerald told me he thought we were in a good position. He talked about the forensic evidence, the camera footage, the pattern of visits, corroborated by Adrian's call records. He was careful and precise the way he always is. I listened to most of it. What I was thinking about was a morning about 3 weeks after Dottie died, when I drove out to the land. Just the property at that point. No road. You had to park on the shoulder and walk in through the tree line. I walked all the way to the back where the creek runs, and I sat on a rock, and I cried in the way you can only cry when there is absolutely no one around to see it. I thought about that land meaning something. I thought about it meaning something enough to kill for, and I thought about how wrong she had been about what it meant to me. It was never about the money. It was never about the acreage or the asset value or whatever number a financial advisor puts on 40 acres in western North Carolina. It was about a man named Earl Briggs who worked a feed store in Surrey County his whole life and dreamed of land with water on it and passed that dream to his daughter Dottie, who passed it to a man who loved her, who passed it to their son. That was what she'd tried to take. Not the land. The line. The trial is scheduled for later this year. Gerald says we're ready. Detective Howell calls me once a month to update me, which I appreciate and which tells me he's one of the good ones. Adrian drives up most weekends now. We sit on the porch and drink coffee. I make it myself. He's learned not to offer. And we talk about his grandfather and about the creek and about nothing in particular. Last month, he spent a Saturday out at the property with me, walking the fence line. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. He asked me once on the drive back why I didn't just call the police right away. Why I'd planned it the way I did instead of going straight to the authorities the morning I left the hospital. I thought about it for a moment. I said, because I wanted there to be no question. I wanted every piece in place so that when it came apart completely, and because I needed to know I wasn't the confused old man she was counting on me to be. Adrian was quiet. Then he said, "You're the least confused person I've ever known." I looked out the window at the hills going by. The trees this time of year just beginning to turn, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happy exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that stays. I thought about Dottie. I thought about what she would have said. She would have said, "You stubborn old fool. I told you those hills were worth fighting for." She would have been right. She usually was. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not just the facts of it, the bottle, the lab report, the courtroom, but the whole shape of it. How something that terrible could grow so quietly inside what looked like an ordinary life. Serena didn't make one bad decision in a moment of anger. She made dozens of careful ones over months. She smiled at the right times. She called on the right days. She brought coffee with both hands. That kind of patience doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from wanting something so badly that you're willing to hollow yourself out to get it. And the thing she wanted was never really the land. It was what the land represented, the end of me, and everything that came after. I think about that sometimes, how greed doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't show up loud. It learns your schedule. It remembers how you take your coffee. What I know now, sitting on this porch with the hills in front of me, is that what saved me wasn't luck. It was paying attention. It was the part of me that noticed the smile that didn't reach the eyes, the phone call that used the phrase "for your benefit" one too many times, the tiredness that felt different from normal tired. I had every reason to dismiss those feelings. I was older. I was grieving. I was the kind of man people expected to be confused. I could have talked myself out of every single instinct I had. I didn't. That matters. There's something nobody tells you about getting older, that the world starts to treat your judgment like a liability. Your hesitation becomes confusion. Your memory becomes unreliable. Your caution becomes paranoia. And if you let people convince you of that long enough, you start to believe it yourself. You start to second-guess the very instincts that kept you alive and upright for 6 decades. I almost did. Lying in that hospital bed, I ran through every version of the story where I was the problem, where I had slipped, where I was imagining things, where I was just a lonely old man looking for someone to blame because the real losses in my life, Dottie, the years, the things that don't come back, were too large and too permanent to point a finger at. But intelligence isn't about having all the answers right away. It's about staying honest with yourself long enough to find them. It's about knowing the difference between what you feel and what you can prove and working methodically from one toward the other. Hugh knew something was wrong before I said a word. Because he listened. Gerald knew what to do because he'd spent years building the kind of careful mind that holds up under pressure. Dwayne installed those cameras without asking too many questions because he understood, the way practical people do, that preparation is not paranoia. None of us were heroes. We were just people who paid attention and didn't look away. What I want to say to anyone who has ever been told their instincts are wrong, their concerns are overblown, their suspicions are just age or grief or fear, is this: you are allowed to trust what you know. Not recklessly, not without evidence, but the feeling that something is not right is not a flaw. It is intelligence doing its job before the rest of you has caught up. Adrian drives up most weekends now. We walk the fence line. We talk about the creek, about the cabin we might build someday, about his grandfather who worked a feed store his whole life and dreamed of land with water on it. That dream is still here. It outlasted everything Serena tried to do to it. That's the thing about what you build carefully and love honestly. It is harder to destroy than people think. Dottie knew that. I'm still learning it. But I'm learning it on my own porch, with my own coffee, watching my own hills. And that's enough.